Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor, and this town is still reeling from the news Friday midday that U.S. Attorney David Weiss of Delaware has been named a special counsel to investigate the Hunter Biden probe. You know, the thing he's already been investigating for over 4 years. And certainly one thing is for certain, the media can't ignore this story anymore. We've been telling you, according to the research that the great folks at Newsbusters and Media Research Center has put together, that they've done whatever they can on the networks and on certain cable news outlets and in the New York Times and Washington Post to ignore the IRS whistleblowers, to ignore the Devon Archer testimony, to ignore the crime right in front of their face. And they can't now. They had to talk about it. But one of the things that you heard from them was a lot of excuses, a lot of shock, and a lot of explanations that don't really seem to match up with the facts at hand. Well, thankfully, we don't have to worry about a journalist from the New York Times or the Washington Post or some broadcast Sunday show anchor like Chuck Todd. We've got a former U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia and a former special prosecutor himself, Joe diGenova. Joe, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, first of all, I'd like to break this down in a couple of different ways. The first is this cynical ploy to appoint David Weiss, of all people, as special counsel. Everybody sees through that, don't they?
Yes, of course they do. It's kind of hard not to, unless you refuse to see what's before your eyes. It's a joke. He can't be a special counsel by the terms of the regulations, but that doesn't matter. Because this whole entire thing has been political. Just imagine the guy who's investigated for 5 years comes up with absolutely nothing, comes up with a fraudulent plea deal. He and the defense counsel commit a fraud on the court by presenting it to the court and not explaining it fully, that it allows for complete immunity. The judge rejects the deal, and then the guy with a straight face comes out and says, okay, Mr. Attorney General, please make me a special counsel so I can continue to cover up for the Biden family.
Right.
This is ludicrous, and everybody knows it.
In fact, if you were appointed as a special counsel, which would be amazing, wouldn't Mr. Weiss be a target of the investigation? Wouldn't you be looking into his office's operations over the last 4.5 years?
Well, I consider their conduct to be highly suspicious, unprofessional, and unethical, and in violation of all the standards of federal prosecution that run the Justice Department that are written down. He has actually, if you look at what he's done with the defense counsel, he's refused to allow search warrants. He's given them notice of search warrants. He's refused to push for indictments. He's allowed statutes of limitations to expire, even though the defense counsel offered to give him a tolling of the statute, that is an extension of the statute. So the question is, who is Mr. Weiss representing? Is it the United States or is it the Biden family? And by asking that question, it clearly disqualifies him from being a special counsel and makes him someone who's worthy of investigation.
Joe, along those same lines, I'd love for you to shed a little bit of light on what you know, and I know that you have some personal understanding of this, what you know about the political and legal scene in Delaware itself. The fact that Mr. Weiss is the man who was chosen to be the U.S. attorney for Delaware, which of course is Joe Biden's state. Joe Biden's son was the Attorney General. Hunter Biden, many of the crimes happened in Delaware. What should we know about Delaware and the fact that Mr. Weiss, if he rose to the level of U.S. attorney, what involvement he's got in Delaware politics?
Well, first of all, you need to know that Delaware used to be a bipartisan state, but it isn't anymore. It's a Democratic state. It's also a small southern state. It's always been that. But it's locked in time in Mississippi in 1964. You might as well have, some of the worst sheriffs in the world running law enforcement sheriffs from the civil rights movement down south running law enforcement in the state. The state has a reputation for corrupt law enforcement at the state level. It has a reputation for being a Biden stronghold, that everything involving Biden goes through filters of political power brokers. Nothing about them ever gets said or written about in the papers. Delaware is locked up Biden territory, and that means that Mr. Weiss never would have been approved by the two Democratic senators, Chris Coons and Tom Carper, were he not a solid, reliable, pro-Biden person. And he, if nothing, has proved during his tenure that he is definitely a pro-Biden person. and really an embarrassment to the Department of Justice.
That's what I thought. And then one other thing that is confusing people is this. We know, we've seen the video, we've played it here on the show many times. We know that Merrick Garland, in sworn testimony before Chuck Grassley and the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, said that Mr. Weiss had complete autonomy. If he wanted to bring charges, he doesn't have to ask permission of the Justice Department. If he wants to bring charges in another jurisdiction, he would not be stopped by the Justice Department. Merrick Garland swore on that under oath. He was asked about it 2 months ago when the whistleblower story started to take off, and he stood by his testimony. So, Joe, if he has all that autonomy, and if he can bring charges in any district without the permission of the Attorney General, why on earth would he have to be named special counsel now?
Well, that's a very good question. And the only answer is because they needed to do a political show of force. Because since their plea deal, which was a corrupt plea deal blessed by the Justice Department, since it was destroyed by the federal judge, Judge Nietka in Delaware, they had to figure out a way to look like they were serious about this. And that was to have Mr. Weiss request to be a special counsel, requesting all the powers that he allegedly told the people that he already had. He told some people he didn't have them. He told some people he did. Merrick Garland said he did have the power. Obviously, he didn't, because Merrick Garland just gave it to him for the first time the other day. This is, of course, when you watch Merrick Garland at that news conference the other day, in which he refused to take questions. That's the second news conference in a row, which he refused to take questions. He looked like he was a hostage. He was giving a bland statement. He could barely muster the strength to do it. And the reason for that is he's embarrassed.
Yeah.
He knows that what he is doing is wrong. He's politically embarrassed. He's being forced to do it by the White House. And make no mistake about it, the White House is running the Justice Department, along with the corrupt Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco.
Joe, a couple facts that I need cleared up with regard to the law in these matters, with regard to what it appears the Biden family's been involved with. If you're selling access to an elected official, somebody as high up as the vice president, do you have to show, if you deliver that access, like, for instance, getting him on a speakerphone for a phone call, or getting him to stop by a dinner in a Tony Georgetown restaurant, do you have to show that something specific regarding legislation or policy was discussed, or just the mere act of getting that access is enough to prove a case?
Just the access is enough to prove the case, but you would love to have some actions. And in this case, they've already been established. He fired Victor Shokin. Victor Shokin was fired at the request of the Burisma board, on which sat Hunter Biden and Devin Archer. And they did the fire. Joe Biden did the firing and did the will of the people in Burisma after his family received millions of dollars from Burisma and Zlochevsky, the head of Burisma. So we already have all the evidence necessary. The Victor Shokin case alone is enough to impeach the president and also to indict him for crimes including bribery and conspiracy. But you don't need it technically.
All right, so we've spent a pretty good amount of time here sort of laying out what's wrong, what happened, and why it's an outrage, and why it appears to be a cover-up or obstruction of justice. The next step is now, instead of just whining about it, what can be done about it? And stay with us. That's exactly what we're going to ask Joe diGenova in our very next segment. You are watching O'Connor Tonight on Salem News Channel.